and welcome to The Quiet Riot, where we talk film, television, and media with an emphasis on old movies, mysteries, and nostalgia favorites. I'm your host Ainsley, and today we are discussing the low-budget science fiction horror film The Blob, released in 1958. If you haven't watched this movie, it is available on Max, and anywhere else I can find it will be put in the description box below. If you would like to watch it before going further into this, it is going to be a spoiler-filled review, and I'm going to discuss some behind the scenes trivia, pre-production, post-production, and my own thoughts about how this film unintentionally gets deep and really hits modern audiences with a big ol' whammy. At the start of The Blob, not unlike many a science fiction film, we have a couple who are kissing and chatting in a convertible, and she's a bit worried that he says the things that he says and he takes all the girls to this place, but she's his best girl. And while they are there, they witness the fall of a meteor. Now, this isn't some big old meteor or crash of an alien. This is something a bit different than was typical of the time, and it's still not very typical of modern science fiction. This was in fact a molten rock of some kind that ended up crashing on Earth, and its inner substance is a slime-like goo of some sort, and an old man ends up using a stick to pick it up, and this is actually really smart. It didn't really work out in his favor, but it's a lot better than the people who tend to touch it with their own skin and then taste things. I see this a lot more in like crime fiction and stuff like that, but gross. Really smart decision, doesn't work out for the poor old man, and the couple come upon him, and the slime is starting to grow and get bigger as it goes over his hand and his arm. The thought of this really freaks me out, and it really, like, I am interested to see the remake. I never saw the remake from the 1980s, though it does sound like that one really plays more into the actual terror of it as opposed to just the oddness of it. Steve, played by Steve McQueen, and his girlfriend, Jane, played by Anita Corset, end up taking the man to the doctors. Now, the doctor prior to this moment had told them that had called someone and he was going to a conference, and we all know this is going to play into some of the non-believers in town, because when they come upon him and take him inside, they end up leaving to essentially see if they can find anything that can be of help to the doctor to figure out what was going on. So you have Steve and Jane leave the doctor, who is alone with this man who is being devoured by some unknown substance, and they go to also find the man's dog. Spoiler alert, the dog does in fact survive. I spent a good portion of this movie being utterly anxious of the dog's survival. I mean, if there's anybody that you can trust to tell you what's going on in a horror movie, it is 100% the dog. So I gotta root for the dog. They go back to the doctor's office, but unfortunately by this point, both the nurse, the patient, and the doctor has been or is being devoured by the blob, and it is Steve who witnesses this alone, but his girlfriend Jane does believe him. However, the police do not. When they go back to the office, it is all a complete and total mess. They believe that someone may have broken in and that the doctor has left to go to a conference, but they're not believing at all. They're not even, I guess, checking in on the possible patient, checking in on the nurse. We then see the mechanic who, one of the mechanics leaves, the other mechanic is underneath the car, and the blob devours him as well while he's under there. And of course, this being the 1950s and it being something that's low budget, we only get to see his legs. And honestly, the idea of what's happening is personally scary enough for me. Being eaten alive is a terrifying concept, and when such little is known about something, I can just imagine that it's suffocating and it burns, and it's like the utter thought of what could be happening. But of course, this being very low budget 1950s, the whole thing can kind of make you giggle a little bit. So we now have 4 missing people, and the police and others are not really taking Steve and Jane very seriously. Their parents both take them home, but they end up sneaking out so they can go and warn the town. They end up going to the theater where they know their friends are going to be, and they end up telling them what was going on. No one sees that there is this blob coming through the projector's booth. He got the projector guy. He is a bunch of people running out of the theater. This is the most recognizable scene from the movie. I had never seen it prior to this moment, but I know I have seen clips of people running out of the theater. The blob is massive at this point, so he definitely must have gotten some few people that we didn't know of. It probably did get quite a few of the theater's patrons. The blob is now coming throughout the doors, and of course, this being a horror movie, the 18-year-old Steve and his girlfriend are the ones that are leading the charge. Now, Jane has a brother that is quite a bit younger than her, and he is out and about, and they end up running into each other and going into a diner where the blob ends up essentially like not devouring, but going over the entire diner, and it starts going into the windows, and they've pretty much decided that this is it for them. But of course, it is the last minute. It is encroaching in on them, and Steve has a that was given to him by the diner, and he ends up using it on the blob. Realizes what is used in the fire extinguisher is causing the blob to kind of like freeze and retract. So he ends up finding a way to get a hold of them, which is pretty much like the phone is off the cord, and so he's like yelling and they're listening into everything that is happening. And so he tells them how they can get this thing under control, and the fire department as well as residents of the town end up coming to the rescue. And so it's a whole town really makes a difference and makes a change and comes together to essentially see this happen. It's a big old happy ending. We don't see the dog at this ending moment, but I choose to make the decision that he 100% survived. We did see him at this moment. There's a couple points that I missed, and we're going to get into that now. And they make a decision that they've got to essentially get this blob to a cold place. And so they take him to Antarctica, and the last line is him saying, "As long as it stays frozen." And when I say this hit me as a modern audience member who's very much aware of climate change, I knew that we might be worrying about a blob unfreezing in Antarctica and growing to take over the world. With all that being said, let's get into some trivia, some pre-production, behind the scenes, reception, and some of my own personal thoughts on the Blob. Is it still worth a watch? Did I like it? How did I feel? So the Blob, again, is a very low budget. It's pretty cheesy, um, but I didn't hate it as much as critics seemed to at the time. The New York Times on director Irving Yeward's work, unfortunately his picture talks itself to death, even with the Blob nibbling away at everybody in sight. And most of his trick effects under the direction of Irvin S. Yeward Jr. look pretty phony. On the credit side, the camera very snugly frames a small town background, a store, a church spire, several homes, and a theater. The color is quite good. The Blob rolls around in at least a dozen horrible looking flavors, including raspberry. The acting is pretty terrible itself. There is not a single becomingly familiar face in the cast, headed by young Steve McQueen and Annetta Corset. I totally get what they're saying. It's definitely not like the best acted film, nor is it really one of the best of the period or science fiction films in general, but I would still say watch it once. It's a pretty quick and easy film to get through, though I would say there's a few moments in the film that could have been completely taken out or cut down. Particularly there's like a little scene where they're like racing backwards, and there's like, when I had quoted Friends, there was just like a weird relationship there, and some things just aren't necessary, and I felt it was them trying to give a little bit more personality to the character and seemingly add a bit of their life. But I think it would have just done, it didn't really do the film a favor. We could have cut back on that scene with the other kids before meeting them prior to their time in the theater, and then how they helped at the end to get the whole Blob situation under control. So I completely understand wanting to introduce them sooner. I just found the way that they introduced them, the whole entire scene was just a drag down, and really like took the enjoyment out of it, and really kind of slowed it down. It should have went them leaving, maybe kind of intertwined, like telling them, hey, this is what we're doing, and then them going and then meeting up again at the theater. I don't think there was a lot of extra stuff that was needed. I do, however, think that this film was a lot better than what some other people were saying. Neil deGrasse Tyson has this as his favorite alien invasion film, particularly for science fiction reasons, while Joe Dante and others usually list this as one of the worst horror films of all time, and Joe Dante identifying it in his famous Monsters of Filmland, released in 1964. When The Blob premiered as the B film on a double feature with I Married a Monster from Outer Space, it was then quickly moved up to the main feature. Audiences liked the Blobs, but critics didn't really give so kindly to it. Audiences had initially really liked the fact that this film was in color, and it just wasn't as much of a melodrama of sorts that I Married a Monster and some of the other alien invasion films of that time. I also do not believe that this Blob is actually a sentient being. I believe it's more of a substance, as it did come in a meteor, so it's just something from outer space that essentially just mindlessly consumes living things, or like meat things. The film was directed by Irving Yeward from a script by Kay Linker and Theodore Simpson, and it's an independent science fiction horror film that premiered in 1958 and was distributed by Paramount in a double feature with I Married a Witch. I did it again. I Married a Monster from Outer Space! Double feature with I Married a Monster from Outer Space, reportedly inspired by the discovery of star jelly in Pennsylvania in 1950. The film was originally titled The Milton Meteor until the producers heard screenwriter Kay Linker refer to the film's monster as the Blob. There are other sources that give a different account, however, stating that the film went through several title changes before settling on the Blob. Apparently, the monster was called the Mass in the shooting script before they decided to call it the Glob. They altered this, finding out that the cartoonist Walt Kelly had used the Glob as a title for his Pogo children's book, and they believed that they couldn't use the title because of this. This then inspired them to change it to the Blob. The film's budget was $120,000, but it only ended up costing them $110,000, so they knocked out like a good portion of that, and they ended up earning $4 million at the box office. So this was definitely a box office success. And was a success with audiences. The Blob was filmed in and around Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, with principal photography taking place in the summer of 1957 at Valley Forge Studios. It is a few days later. Unfortunately, my sound for the last little portion of this video was not great at all, and even though I tried to salvage it, it was just really difficult to salvage the camera audio and make it sound anything like the rest of the video's audio, so I decided to refilm it a few days later, and I just have a few more facts for you and a few more thoughts before the end. For the diner scene, a photograph of the building was put on a gyroscopically operated table onto which cameras had been mounted. The table was shaken and the blob rolled off. When the film negative was printed in reverse, it appeared to be oozing over the building. The blob was filmed in color and projected at a 1.66 ratio, then known as the Paramount format. Paramount acquired the blob for $300,000 from Jack Harris and spent another $300,000 promoting it. According to Tim Dirks, it was one of a wave of cheap teen movies for the drive-in market. Exploitative cheap fare created especially for young people in a newly established teen drive-in genre. Prior to films of the 1950s, there weren't a lot of movies that were specifically targeted towards teenagers. A lot of the movies were either targeted towards families as a whole or more adult audiences. And then when the 50s came around, there were a lot more films as well as television that tend to cater towards a more like teenage and new adult audience, and horror and science fiction was kind of where some of that started to blossom. Harris eventually bought back the rights from Paramount and Allied Artists Pictures Corporation and reissued it as a double feature with his and Eworth's Dinosaurs in 1964. While The Blob is not one of my personal favorites from my walk down sci-fi horror of the 1950s lane, it definitely has some entertainment value. There are certain moments that I wish would have either been cut entirely or cut back. They were scenes that were just too much of filler, and I think tried to establish itself too much as a teen film when it wasn't necessary. I specifically am thinking about the teenagers doing the drag race, or like the backwards drag racing, and thinking that they could have just met them outside and then taken them to the place where they went to find the dog and find whatever they could find for the doctor, and then they go off and they reconvene again, meet up when they are at the cinema. So the way they introduced certain characters, just particularly these teen characters, weren't really good, and I think it was trying too hard to appeal to that specific audience. It is really weird. I say it's weird, but it's not necessarily weird. It's weird for me to see Steve McQueen as a teenager at 28 years old when he looks so much like he's 28 or older, as opposed to, some characters, even though they don't necessarily look like teenagers, they definitely can more pass for a teen, whereas Steve McQueen definitely couldn't in this role. And Steve McQueen has never been like this great actor, not even when he grew up. He certainly got a lot better. This is his first film. Now, I wouldn't speak as harshly about him as critics did at the time, though he's definitely not the best in that field. And he's definitely not alone in that. There definitely seem to be more like caricatures of small town folk and teenagers, but I really appreciated their use of special effects and what they did. And anytime I see somebody use practical effects, I get really giddy. So that's really cool to kind of look back at this time, whether it's the Blob or another movie, and to see that happening. I can see that a lot of good work was put into this, and I don't want to completely write it off. So I would recommend to check it out at least once. It doesn't take up too much of your time, and there's definitely like certain elements of this where you can tell other people have kind of taken from, and this film has been used for inspiration, and you can kind of see where some of its inspiration came from as well. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch and or listen to this video. I really do appreciate it, and I hope that you decide to stick around by subscribing and ringing that bell to be notified every single time I post. If you like this video and want to see more like it, give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments below. Let me know, have you seen The Blob? What are your thoughts about it? Did you prefer the 1988 remake? Let me know. I love hearing from you. Next week's video will be on Bela Lugosi's Dracula and the sophistication that he brings to the role. If you have anything you would like to recommend to me, or you have anything you would like to see on this channel, please let me know. Not only do comments help with the algorithm, I just also really like to hear from people and hear their thoughts and get recommendations. And if you've done that before, thank you very much. I highly appreciate it. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.